Okay, sorry about that. So this is one of the last two chapters we're going to cover in this class, chapter 6 about interest rates, and then next week we'll do chapter 8. But interest rates are an important topic, really, for anyone who's involved in making financial decisions, whether it's for a for-profit or a nonprofit organization, to understand what impacts interest rates, why an interest rate you may be paying as a person or as an organization is maybe higher than what someone else pays. And so we're going to talk about what some of the factors that essentially influence interest rates are, and then actually go into the components of how an interest rate is quoted, whether it be a home loan, an auto loan, a business loan. There are similar components that go into each of those types of loans. So just to start out with a basic definition, what is an interest rate? Somebody tell me what they think an interest rate is, or what a partial definition of an interest rate would be. Seems to have shrunk. Let's see. Rachel, what do you think?
Some kind of percentage that you have to pay when you on a loan.
Okay. Yep, there's definitely a percentage component to an interest rate, and the way that I would think, or I would encourage you to think about that percentage, or the interest rate itself, it's the cost. It's how you would quantify the cost of money. So there's costs for all sorts of different things: cars, oil, computers, all these different things, and their price fluctuates. Usually goes gradually up, but sometimes it goes down, up and down. And so all these different assets have different prices. You might not think that money has a cost, but it does. The cost to acquire money that you don't currently have is the interest rate. And just like all these other assets, the interest rate is influenced by supply and demand. So if more people, if there's a steady rate or a steady level of money in the economy in the U.S., and more people and businesses want access to more money, that's going to gradually push the cost of money up. It will push interest rates up. And likewise, if there's less demand for money overall in the economy, then it's going to push the cost of money down, so the interest rate will decrease. And I thought a good way to sort of give an example of this, because it is via a bond. We've talked about bonds already. So a bond is essentially, if you're an investor and you invest in a bond, you are loaning another company or a government money. That's what a bond is. When they issue a bond, they are seeking money. They're looking for a loan. And so, and bonds are typically evaluated or quoted, or at least listed, both by price and interest rate. And so let me just hopefully show an example here that will show a little bit about how supply and demand affects the interest rate. And so I'm just going to use, this comes back to these time value money calculations here, and I'm going to use, should I make this bigger? Can you guys see these numbers down here? I'm going to make it a little bigger. What am I at, 100%? All right, make it a little better. And so the example I'm going to give here is on row 19 here, and I've already put some information in here. And so what we're going to use here is, as an example of a bond, is one that matures in 10 years, one that will pay $1,000 at maturity, So at the end of 10 years, you'll get $1,000. And its present value right now is negative 800, which means it would cost you $800 to buy this bond in the first place. We're not going to do anything with payment for this example. And so based on these numbers, let's see what the interest rate is. So do our little calculation here. Rate equals N per, comma, payment, comma, PV, comma, FV. That's all we have to enter. And let me put this out to 2 decimal places. So 2.26%. So if you bought a bond that matured in 10 years, it paid you $1,000 and you paid $800 for it, that's the equivalent of investing and getting a 2.26% return over the course of that 10 years on average, okay? So that's where we're starting. So can anyone remind me how bond prices go up and down? What affects bond prices? What causes them to move?
Supply and demand.
Exactly. Just like stocks, bonds have supply and demand. They're bought and sold just like stocks. They're securities, financial securities. And so supply and demand impacts the price of these. And so if the demand for a particular bond goes up, then what's going to happen to the price?
It's going to go up probably.
It's going to go up, right? Because more people are going to be willing to buy it, and so it's going to cause the price to go up. And this is an interesting thing with how the interest rate for bonds are calculated here. So let's say that this particular bond demand went up, and so on the market it wasn't selling for $800 anymore. It was now selling for $850. Okay, so investors were willing to pay $850 for the same bond that paid $1,000 in 10 years. What's going to happen to the interest rate? It goes down. It goes from 2.26% down to 1.64% because the demand increases. So we're looking at this from the perspective of an investor. Okay. But from the perspective of the person who is issuing the bond, who is seeking money, basically who is looking for a loan, whether this is a business or a government, this means that they actually, in the end, pay less interest for that bond. If people are willing to pay more for that bond, then the issuer gets more money. Because if the U.S. government issues this $1,000 bond right now that will pay them, this $1,000 bond that they'll have to pay in 10 years back to the investor, $1,000, and people are willing to pay $850, that means that the government gets $850. If they can only attract investors if the market will only pay $700 for this bond, so the demand is lower, that's going to cause this average interest rate to go up. So the investor earns more, but on the other side of it, the government, or if it's a corporation, IBM or GE, who are issuing these bonds, they end up getting less money. This is what they get. The present value is what they actually get. And in turn, they end up paying more interest expense over the course of the bond. So in this case, they would end up paying the difference between $700 and $1,000. So they'd end up paying $300 in interest total over 10 years, which equates to 3.63%. So this is one way of sort of seeing how the price of money goes up and down depending on supply and demand. When there's more demand for money, when there are more people seeking bonds, then investors aren't going to be as willing to pay as much. And so if they're willing to pay less, then that means the investor earns more, but the government or the business who's issuing them on actually pays more in interest expense. So money is more costly in that case. And if a lot of investors have a lot of money that they want to invest in bonds, and therefore that will cause the prices of bonds to go up, then the investor earns less in interest, and the company or the government pays less in interest because there isn't as much of a demand for money at that point. There's more of a supply and demand. So does that make sense? Do you have any questions about how the cost of money is reflected in bonds, basically, is what we're looking at right here?
So is this the first part, the cost of money? Is that what we're looking at right now from the book?
Yes. Yeah, this is an example.
Okay. Okay, I just wanted to make sure because I came back a little bit late from the break, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically what this number right here, this percentage represents, is the cost of money. And so again, when there's a higher demand for money, then this rate will go up. It will be more costly to get money for the people seeking the loans. It will also be more beneficial for the investors who are buying these bonds because they'll make more when there's less money out there. And when the demand goes down, then this number also will go down because if there's less demand for money, then there's more available to invest, and the government or this company doesn't have to pay as much in interest to actually get somebody to buy their bond. So I'm hoping that this example is just one of a plethora of examples that are out there where you can see how the interest rate is influenced by supply and demand in the market. And I'll give an example here in a little bit about how in a situation where you're seeking a home loan, how certain factors cause some people to be offered a lower interest rate than other people. And there are about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, there are 5 components that go into computing what the interest rate is on a particular loan, and I'm going to go through those in a little bit. All right, so does anybody have any questions about this example before I sort of move on to the next part? No, okay. I hope that helped. So my next question is, how do you think, so interest rates they influence the economy as a whole. So we've been in a very low interest rate environment since 2009, approximately. And for a number of reasons, the central bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve, has created an environment where interest rates are probably artificially low. So the question is, how do you think low interest rates, impact things like people's willingness to buy goods, especially if they're financing them?
Well, if they're too high, nobody's going to buy anything specifically like cars and houses. If they're low, people will buy. So it's a good time to buy right now.
Right. So you're talking about interest rates being high or low, right?
Right.
Okay. Right. So in general, the impact of having low interest rates, it does 2 things. One, it sort of provides an incentive for people to buy things that would take financing, especially things like cars, and in this case, homes. And that's the real reason why interest rates have been low since 2009, because when the housing bubble sort of burst in 2007, 2008, home prices started to go down dramatically, and that caused a whole raft of issues with mortgages and people's ability to get mortgages and banks' willingness to lend to people. And so in an attempt to free up money and to make sure the housing market didn't do a complete free fall, the government interceded and essentially infused money into the economy. So they made a lot more money available for loans through the banking system. And when they did this, this pushed the interest rate down because all of a sudden there's all this money that's available, and the demand, the increased supply drastically outweighed the demand on money at that point. And so that caused interest rates to go down quite a bit. Right now, home loans, and for the last 2 to 3 years, they've been at historically low rates, like literally in the history of the mortgage business in this country. For the last 50 years, there have never been home loan rates at this low. I think right now, 15-year rates you can get for, if you want a 15-year home loan, you can get it for 2.75% if you have good credit. For a 30-year home loan, you can get for 3.5% credit. So this is they've never been this low, and they'll probably never be this low again. They're not likely to go much lower. And so that's why, so in this period of time, it really encouraged people to buy houses. So that sort of kept the price of houses from really going into a free fall, and actually have inflated them quite a bit. And right now, the housing market is really tight. There's not a lot for sale in the housing market because there is a good amount of demand for homes by people who want to take advantage of these really low interest rates. So that's one side of having low interest rates. It increases people's desire to consume things, to buy things. But the other thing it does, and you may experience this, I'm sure you do if you have a bank account, is it decreases people's desire to save money. Because at the same time you have these really low interest rates for loans, you also have really low interest rates in your savings account. So you're lucky if your savings account right now pays you 0.5%. Whereas 10 years ago, those same savings accounts might be paying, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3%, but certainly more than 0.5%. And so when you think about interest rates, there are two components that you want to think about: how they affect people's desire to buy and how they affect people's desire to save. Because when you have money, you're going to do one of two things, and hopefully this is rehashed from your econ class. You're either going to spend that money, you're going to buy something, or you're going to save that money. If you want to break it down in the simplest terms, that's what you're going to do with money when you have it: buy or save. And so the interest rates, the level of interest rates really impacts this. When interest rates are higher and loans are more expensive, things that people buy with loans, they don't have as much of a desire to pay that great, and they can't afford to pay that much interest for a particular purpose. And so their desire to buy decreases, and hopefully that also means that their savings account pays somewhat higher level of interest than it does right now, so they're more willing to save money. And so that's one of the ways that in a global and a national perspective, that central banks, government banks, that's what the Federal Reserve is. It's basically the U.S. government bank, and it plays a significant part in determining, or at least setting the stage for what the interest rates that we all pay are going to be. So if the central bank decides they want to pull back some of this money that they put out in the country in 2008 and 2009, that will either very drastically or maybe slowly increase our interest rates. And that's likely to happen in the next few years, because one of the negative impacts of keeping interest rates at a low level for a long time is as people want to buy more things, that just inherently will cause the price on those things to gradually creep up. And that will cause, that's inflation basically. So if you have a bunch of people with a lot of money who want to buy things, they're all competing to buy the same amount of resources, whether it's cars or houses or whatever. We're seeing this in the housing market right now. People with access to financing who want to buy houses, and there are a lot of them, causes shortage in houses, which causes prices to creep, not just to creep, but to really to dramatically rise. And right now there's actually a little bit of a fear that we're in another housing bubble, because prices have gone up because the supply can't keep up with demand. But what happens when loans start costing more than 3.5% unless people are able to afford those same type of prices. That will have an impact of gradually pushing, hopefully gradually pushing prices down, or maybe stabilizing them to some degree. So this is how interest rates can affect consumption and savings in a society, and this is what central banks try to influence to keep the economy growing at a steady pace. That's one of their goals. All right, so that's, again, conceptually, you just need to understand how these an environment of low interest rates versus an environment of high interest rates impacts people's decisions to purchase, to buy and save. That's one thing you definitely, I want you to understand. There are some specific things, though, that impact the cost of money or the interest rate, in addition to what the central bank does as far as the supply of money in and out. One of those things that can impact interest rates, which also impacts the demand for money, is the availability of productive investment opportunities to individuals or businesses. And what I mean here is, does a business have an opportunity to, if it's a home builder, for instance, what sort of opportunities do they have to have new developments, to build new developments, and what's the payback on that? What's the return on assets? And one of the key things to understand about interest rates from a business perspective, if you're making decisions about things, you want to be able to calculate what your return on assets is. And you want to be able to compare that to the interest rate that you would be paying if you're going to finance this development, if you're going to get a loan for a project. Because what has to happen for you to be able to make money is your return on asset has to be higher than the interest rate that you're paying. Because basically what you're doing is you're taking a loan and they're giving you, let's say, $1 million. If they're charging you 5% interest on that loan, that means every year you're going to be paying $50,000 in interest. So just for having that money. So if your return on assets, let's say, is 8%, that means for all of the assets in your company, if you take them all together, you make on average 8% return on those assets. So of that $1 million that you have, if you make 8% on that, that means you're going to make $80,000 a year from that investment. So assuming on average, this is on average. So that means you're making $80,000 a year and you're paying $50,000 a year in interest expense. So your net on that is $30,000. If your return on assets is only 3% and you're still paying 5% interest expense, then you're paying $50,000 in interest a year and you're making $30,000. So you're actually in the hole there. You're losing $20,000 a year based on just comparing those two numbers, your return on assets versus this interest rate that you're paying. And so if there are these opportunities out there that will return a greater percentage amount than what you'd be paying in interest, then in general, businesses are going to take advantage of those and want to pursue those opportunities, because that means in the end, they're going to make money. If there aren't projects that would pay them more than the interest expense that they would be paying on a loan, then they shouldn't go ahead and develop those projects, because in the end, they'll be losing money on those. So the relationship of the return on assets of a company and the interest rate that they would be paying for a loan is really key to know when you're making decisions about which projects you're going to pursue as a company. And that's how interest rates can influence companies' decisions about projects. So we already talked about how consumption and savings, or purchasing and savings, and interest rates interact. Risk levels are another aspect, consideration that impact interest rates. So and by risk level, I mean the possibility of receiving either zero return or a negative return on the investment. So if the risk level increases, then that's going to decrease the likelihood that somebody's going to want to get a loan for money for a project, right? It's the risk return ratio again. As risk increases, you need to have a corresponding increase in return, or it doesn't make any sense to do the project. You're taking on more risk for the same amount of return. It's like if I had the option of purchasing a U.S. government bond that paid 3%, or let's say the bond of, let's say Hagen's is selling bonds right now. Should not be a good idea, but let's just say they were. If they were selling bonds right now and they were offering bonds at 3%, whose bond would you want to buy? The government's or Hagen's? They pay the same amount.
Hagen, or U.S. government.
I have an investment I want to sell you, Luke. No. Yes, the U.S. government. And the only reason is everything else is the same. The risk level for an investment in the U.S. government is much lower than the risk level in Hagen's or any other private enterprise, really, because it's very unlikely that the U.S. government is going to default and not be able to pay its debt. There's a much higher risk level that a private company would. So yeah, the weighing the risk and the reward is a really important part of considerations of investments and projects and things of that nature. And the last factor that can really influence interest rates is the inflation rate. What is the current average inflation rate? So basically, if you're thinking about investing in a project and you calculate that your return on assets is 8%, let's say, but the inflation rate right now is running 7%. Every year, things cost 7% more. That means really, in the end, with an 8% return on your project and a 7% inflation rate, you're really only increasing your buying power by 1% every year. So the inflation rate cuts into those investments that you're making, and it plays an impact just like the interest expense, the interest rate that you're paying. They both cut into the purchasing power that you have at the end of the day from investing in projects and things like that. So, and so the inflation rate is actually one of the 4 factors that directly impact how to calculate what a interest rate is. And we'll talk about that in just a second. All right, so those are just a few conceptual things about interest rates. Any questions about any of that or any other aspects of interest rates that I just talked about or didn't talk about? Silence means no. All right. One term that you definitely need to understand out of Chapter 6 is risk premium. And you need to understand this conceptually, because then we're going to apply different risk premiums to actually calculate a real interest rate. But what a risk premium is the minimum amount of money or interest rate that it would take for an investor to choose a more risky asset over a risk-free asset or a less risky asset. So going back to the example of investing in either a Hagen bond or a U.S. government bond, the difference in there would definitely be a difference in interest rates between those two, because the risk level for Hagen's is higher, substantially higher. And so let's say Hagen's they were selling their bonds and they were averaging 8% return for a 5-year bond, whereas the same U.S. government bond was averaging 3%. So if everything else was equal, the difference between those rates is the risk premium. It's how much it would take an investor an extra 5%, paying an investor an extra 5% to take on the added risk of loaning money to Hagen's versus loaning money to the U.S. government. So in general, that's what a risk premium is, and there are 4 different risk premiums that we're going to talk about. But just from a conceptual level, whenever you're talking about risk premium, it's what it takes an investor to give, excuse me, loan money or to invest money in a project that is riskier than a comparable project. And we'll talk about the different risk here in a second. Okay, so I'm going to pull up under week 8 here. There is, and in chapter 6, there's a good visual of what these different risk premiums are. Let's see, what page is it on? Page 189 in your book if you have it, or you can just click on the chapter 6 interest rate equation.pdf there. Let me expand this. Oops. Okay. Okay. So this is 6-3, that determines a market interest rates. So I'm going to go through these. This is the equation right up here, and R stands for the quoted interest rate. So think about that as what you would be quoted for a car or a loan rate or a business loan. Excuse me, a car or a home loan interest rate or a business loan. These different risk premiums occur in every single loan product that's out there, or at least they're considered to some degree. And so in this equation, everything, all of these 5 components to the right here add up, and they give us a final quoted interest rate here as R. So I'm just going to go through these and describe each one of them. R star here, which is this first component here, is the real risk-free rate of interest. And the risk-free rate of interest is what you would earn if there was an investment that had no risk whatsoever in it. No risk at all. Typically, and so from a practical point of view, there is no risk-free, absolutely risk-free asset or risk-free investment. But what they use to approximate this is a very short-term U.S. government bond. It's called a T-bill, a 30-day T-bill. So it's a loan to the U.S. government, which is seen as one of the most, used to be the most, but now it's one of the most stable governments in the world and least likely to not pay back a loan. So very little risk. And it's only for 30 days, so it's for a super short period of time. So let's see if I can find this here. If I go to, where is this? So there's this, if you've never been at bankrate.com, I encourage you to go there at some point. It's got all sorts of great information on it. Let's see if I can find this. Interest rates, treasury.aspx. Yay, I found it. Okay, so you can find mortgage rates and interest rates on all sorts of things at Bankrate. And I'm going to show another example here in a second with this. But on this Treasury security page, it shows the different interest rates that are paid on these different. So a T-bill, a Treasury bill, is a very short-term U.S. government bond. It's less than a year. And so this is a list of Treasury securities here. And the shortest maturity is 91 days. So it actually doesn't show a 30-day, but it shows a 91-day T-bill, which is pretty close. And so right now, that particular T-bill is paying 0.325%, so less than 1/3%. And you can see as the rate of time to maturity increases, so does the interest rate. And I'll talk about why that happens in a second. So it goes from 0.325 for 90 days loan to the U.S. government to a 1.82% interest rate for a 10-year bond loan to the government. So we can approximate, if we want to use this 90-day T-bill rate, this is the approximate rate of what a risk-free asset or investment would be, 0.325. All right, I'm going to go back to, oops. Try this one more time here. It's already there. So that's R star. And really, you can calculate this by figuring out what these are or estimating them and adding them in there. And you'll come up with this final quoted interest rate. So R star, that's the first component of an interest rate. The second is IP, which means inflation premium. And what the inflation premium is what the, and you don't know what this is for sure because it's a measure of what you think the future inflation rate will be, but it's the measure of the average, what you believe, what you estimate the average rate of inflation will be over the course of the loan. So if it's a 10-year bond that you're buying from the US government, it would be what you believe the average inflation rate will be for the next 10 years. Right now, the average interest rate for the last 3 to 5 years has been about the same. It's been between 1 and 2%. Right now, it's about 1, maybe even a little less than 1%. So that means every year, if you have a 1% inflation rate, things get approximately 1% more expensive. But banks need to take this into account because it means that in the future, you'll be paying them back with cheaper dollars. So if they loan money to you today, the money that you pay them today is worth more than it will be a year from now if there's a 1% inflation rate, right? Because they will have 1% less purchasing power in the future, which also means they're cheaper dollars for you. But that's why the inflation premium is added into these interest rates, because the banks and any other investors need to take that into account, that they're going to be receiving cheaper dollars in the future. So that's what the inflation premium is, just the average expected rate of inflation over the course of the investment. DRP, and this comes into play significantly. It's called the default risk premium. And really what this means is it's some estimate of, it's the risk premium that you're not going to be able to pay back the loan that you get from the bank, or that Hagen's won't be able to repay you 5 years from now on the bond that you purchased them. So it's the risk of them defaulting on it. Defaulting means not making a payment associated with the security. This is for, and I'll have an example of this here right after we get done going through this equation, but this is estimated for personal borrowers, for home loans and things like that. They use your credit score to try to estimate how likely it is that you're going to default on a loan. And then they, based on your credit score, they will either increase or decrease your default risk premium. If you have a better credit score and there's less, in their eyes, there's less of a risk that you're going to default on a loan, then you'll have a lower default risk premium. If you don't have a stellar credit history and you've missed payments, or maybe especially if you've declared bankruptcy in the past, then your credit score is going to be lower, and the risk premium they're going to charge you for a loan compared to somebody else is going to be higher, which is why your quoted interest rate will also be higher. So that's what DRP stands for, default risk premium. LP stands for liquidity premium. And really what this means is how easy is it for them to turn this investment into cash. So for things like home loans, because you're in a say a 15 or a 30-year contract with the lender, there aren't as many options for them to immediately liquidate their investment as it would be if it were a publicly traded stock or a publicly traded bond. Because in the public stock markets, you can trade bonds and stocks and pretty much within 2 or 3 days turn your investment into money. You can become liquid. Liquid just essentially means your ability to turn an investment into cash. How long it takes you to do that. So the longer it takes you to turn an investment to cash, the higher the liquidity premium will be. The shorter period of time that it takes to turn that investment to cash, the shorter or the lower the liquidity premium will be for that investment. And finally, MRP stands for the maturity risk premium. And what they're measuring here with the maturity risk premium is how long this investment lasts. So if it's a 15-year bond or a 15-year loan, it has a shorter and lower maturity risk premium than if it's a 30-year bond or a 30-year loan. And that's simply because as time goes on and you have this investment, you're exposed to more risks. That's why a 30-day, if we go back here to the Treasury bills here, excuse me, that's why this 90-day Treasury bill only pays 0.325%, whereas this 182-day Treasury bill pays 0.48, because you're holding on to that security 90 days longer until it matures, and so there's some additional risk to that. And so that's added on to that. So you can think about all of these Treasury securities here as being the same, with the exception of one thing, and that's how long you have to keep them until they mature. So shorter periods of time have lower maturity risk premiums and they pay less interest. Longer periods of time have higher degrees of maturity risk premium, so they pay higher interest rates. So those are so basically lenders or investors are calculating each of these or estimating these, adding them up and coming up with R, and that's what the quoted interest rate you will get for a home loan or a car loan or it's how investors to some degree try to estimate what they should be willing to pay for a bond type of thing. So this is just a real basic calculation for getting to a quoted interest rate. So anybody have any questions about any of these variables or how they're used or how we get to R?
I probably will in the future.
Okay. Well, this is definitely a chapter that you need to read. In addition to hearing this from me, you want to read the chapter and understand this conceptually.
Yeah, I've read it. I think I need to do it again.
Okay. Yeah. It's not simple stuff. Let me try to show an example, though, of how these play out in the world of loans and attempting to get loans. So I'm going to go back to. Can I move this over? Good. I'm going to go back to my bank rate site here, and this has all sorts of different things on it. If you're a numbers geek, you can click on this calculators link up here, and literally you have 30, 40 different calculators here to calculate auto payments, home loans, investment calculations, retirement calculations, all sorts of good tools here. But what we're going to look at right now is it's also, so this site is one of the ways they make their money, obviously, is advertising. You see this happy lady down here waving at us. And that one of the things they advertise are loans. And so lenders, banks, and other home loan companies will use this site to market their loans. And I also you can look over here, and they give you a daily estimate of, or these are averages based on what's submitted to their site, of what people are paying or what you would be paying for a home loan or an auto loan, or what you can get on a CD and things like that. And then you can actually click on these and it will take you to some products that you can buy. So there are a number of good tools. But one of the things I want to show you here is if we go into, if we say we're looking to get a mortgage, and we want to buy a house, and we want to find a lender here. So we say get a mortgage. We're going to look at 30-year fixed loans. Just start with that. We can look at a few different kinds. And so they have you put in your zip code or your city here. You say whether it's a new purchase, a mortgage, or whether it's a refinance. Put in your loan amount. Let's just do a real even $200,000 here. So say you're going to ask you how much you're going to put down. 20% down is what you need to put down on a home if you don't want to pay any extra fees every month. So we'll just assume we have 20%. Points, we won't worry about that. Paying points on your loan, which is essentially additional fees when you get the loan, can lower your overall interest rate over the life of the loan, but I'm not going to really talk about that here. Your FICO score is your credit score. This is one of your credit scores here. And so you have an option of 740 plus is the best range, or the best bracket of credit scores. I think it goes up to 810 or 20 or something like that. So if you're above 740, that means you are in really good, you have a great credit history. If you have missed some payments on things in the past, if you've declared bankruptcy, then your score will be lower than that, sometimes substantially. But they sort of allow you to pick your range here. I'm going to leave it at highest credit score right now at 740. And then you can go down here and pick different types of mortgages that you want to see. We'll do a 15-year fix. These are pretty typical options here. A fixed loan just means you pay the same amount from month 1 to month 360 if you're in a 30-year. Your payment's never going to change over the course of the loan. So you can go down here, put this information in, click Find Rates, and it will spit out a bunch of different options for you. I'm going to sort by APR, which is the average percentage rate. That includes both the rate itself and any fees that they charge you over here. So it looks like that based on the information that I put in there, that if I was, everything else being the same, if all these lenders were the same, and they're certainly not, but if they were, then I just wanted the lowest interest rate on a 30-year mortgage, I would go with this First Cal at 3.498%. That would be the average rate of interest that I'd pay based on this information above for a 30-year mortgage. The nice thing, they give you up here is a summary of the results. So for all the lenders who are offering 30-year mortgages, it ranges for me between, or for this submission, between 3.49% at the low end to 3.83% at the high end. Shows you the national average here and the bank rate average and things like that. They also gave me information here, though, for 15-year fixed mortgage. And you can see that the rates for a 15-year mortgage are different than for the 30-year mortgage. It goes between 2.75% up to 3.55%. And the only reason for that really is the fact that the mortgage is for a shorter period of time. So the maturity risk premium, the MRP, is lower because the lender is only giving you money for 15 years, not 30 years. And so because all this information was exactly the same for all of these quotes, they're not really quotes, they're sort of quotes. The only difference is that maturity risk premium. And so you can actually see that from a 15-year to a 30-year mortgage, there's actually approximately a 0.74% difference just based on maturity risk premiums in that for a 15-year difference in loan period of time. So that's one thing to keep in mind. You will pay lower interest rates for a shorter period of loan. You will also, if you're an investor, you will also earn less if you invest in a 15-year bond versus a 30-year bond. So you can look at it from either perspective there. But that's just the only thing that changes there is the maturity risk premium. So you can sort of see how a change in that impacts the overall quoted interest rate. Another thing that we can look at with this website is how the default risk premium, if that changes, how that impacts a quoted interest rate. And again, the default risk premium is just the risk that a lender will not get repaid for the money that they loan someone. And the way that they estimate that for personal loans is via this credit score. So the higher your credit score, the less likely, technically, or according to the lenders, they would like to hope that less likely you are going to be to default on the loan and not pay it back. The lower your credit score, the more likely you are to. And so these are all just averages and percentages here that they're trying to use to estimate the likelihood of someone defaulting on a loan. So these rates here were given with a high credit score, 740 plus. So keep this in mind. For a 30-year mortgage, we could get one for 3.49%, and for a 15-year, we could get it for 2.75% if our credit score was above 740. But let's say we don't have perfect credit. And here they only allow us to go down to 660. I would love to be able to go down to like 400. You would have a lot less lenders who would even be willing to offer a loan at that point. But let's just say we're in this 660 to 679 range. So our credit score is anywhere from 60 to 80 points lower. So if I change that one thing, then hopefully, then these numbers change. Well, at least they did for the 30-year product. So they went from 3.49% up to 3.62%. So that means you're going to be paying about 0.13% higher interest rate just based on a lower credit score, everything else being the same. I'm pretty surprised that this number here for the 15-year didn't increase somewhat. I wonder if this higher end number did though. So we're at 3.46% at this credit score. If we increase it, is it going to change it? Actually, that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, so it actually went up for a 15-year product, at least the high end did. But in general, this is sort of what you can expect to experience as the credit score goes lower, is that the interest rate that you'll pay goes higher. And that's simply because this DRP here, this default risk premium, increases as your credit score goes down. So at least that's the estimate of the lender. And so that's just one way that you can sort of see the impact of both the default risk premium in the case of the credit score and the maturity risk premium, how they impact quoted interest rates for these products like home loans. And if I were to, this calculation here to get to this quoted interest rate is really just simple addition. Once the lender comes up with these numbers, they just add these 5 things up, and that's what the quoted interest rate is. So, okay, so those are the components of how you calculate an interest rate. And there will be at least, I think, 1 or 2 questions in this Chapter 6 homework that gives you some of this information and asks you to say, it's sort of like a fill in the blank. It gives you everything but inflation premium, and then it asks you what the inflation premium is based on knowing these other variables. So, all right. Any questions about that or anything else that I just talked about? Because that, I think, is all I'm going to cover tonight. No.
Doesn't Bankrate have a calculator too that tells you or like calculates how much you can afford to pay based on your income?
They might. Yeah, mortgage calculators. How much can I afford? How much house can I afford? Yeah. So, and this is just, these are estimates. These are tools that help you. The lender is the one who in the end determines whether or not they want to loan you money based on this information. But yeah, you can put in, this has an area for your gross monthly income, how much you would be paying down on the home, what the interest rate, the loan is, other things like how much you'd be paying for homeowners insurance, how much your real estate taxes would be, and all your other expenses. And then, yeah, apparently it's going to tell you how much you can afford in a mortgage payment every month. Yeah. Cool. I didn't know that was there. Yeah, I encourage you to go to Bankrate and just click on this calculators button up here and look around, because it has all sorts of good tools to calculate these sorts of things. For both auto, home loans, credit card loans. They probably have a So, well, they have a credit card balance transfer calculator, so you can calculate whether or not it makes sense to transfer a balance off your credit card. Yeah, all sorts of good things. All right. Any other questions? No. Okay, so whoops. Let me go here. For next week, there are a few assignments. Again, I'll post that extra credit assignment by Friday at the latest. So we're in week 8 right now. So there are 4 primary assignments. There's some chapter 6 questions and problems. So be clear here. There's one question 6-2, and then there are problems 6-2, same number, but it's a problem, 6-2 through 6-5. So that's one assignment. Another is to get through quiz number 3 in the NNI Nation-Owned Enterprises module. And then the third assignment is another time value money calculation. So I provided the numbers up here and another blank time value money calculation spreadsheet here that you can use for that one. And then the final one is just to read chapter 8, which is the last chapter we're going to cover in the textbook this quarter. All right, that is all I have for the evening. So if you don't have any other questions.
Can you go over the IRR on the time value? I missed that one last class, how to do it.
Sure. Let's see here. Do I have that example here? Oops. Oh, wait, I already have that open. Yes. All right. So IRR. So this is the one where you're evaluating 2 different projects based on how much you're going to invest initially and how much you're going to get out over a period of time. And the reason we're using this as opposed to, say, future value or something like that is because you have these different levels of return that they're uneven levels of return. So you're not going to make $20,000 every year for 5 years. You're going to make $5,000 the first year. You're going to make $20,000 the second, $30,000 the third, etc. So there has to be some way for you to estimate the average rate of return over that period of time. So the way that you use IRR, and you need to sort of structure it in this way where you have the first cell being your initial investment. And again, with an investment or something of that nature where money is going out, where you're paying money out, that's got to be in a negative. If you ever have, well, I'll show you the error message you'll get in a second. But so the initial investment has to be a negative number. And then all the returns, which you can think about as coming back to you or the business, have to be positives. So once you have this laid out, again, with the investment in the first cell and the returns in the other cells, then all you have to do is click on equal IRR and then highlight the entire column, just like that. So click and hold and go all the way to the bottom, release. So we're seeing IRR C30, which is right here, through C35. And then we hit enter. And it gives us 6%. And that's the average. I'm going to go out to 2 decimal places here, 5.55%. That's the average rate of return for this project based on this investment and these returns. Let me just show you the error message you'll get if you forget about the negative number. It says NUM. If you get this, then you need to look, and probably you have forgotten that one of these, the investment itself, needs to be a negative number. So if you put that negative back in there, it should come back like that. So you can do the same thing over here to compare it. This is a different project, Project Y here. Highlight those cells, hit enter, and do it out to 2 decimal places. And so based on these calculations, we would choose Project X. It has a slightly higher average rate of return than Project Y. And they both, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and the one of the things I did here with this with these examples is that they both return $120,000 over 5 years, but they do it at different rates. So this one gets a higher rate of return quicker, and this one, it takes a longer time to get there. But over the course of 5 years, they both give out $120,000. But because this project gets theirs quicker and there's a time value of money, this also has a higher rate of return. So, any other questions? No. Okay, well, I will see you next Tuesday. I'll send you all an email when I get that extra credit posted to Canvas, so you'll know it's out there. And I highly encourage you to practice with that, not only for the points, but just for the practice with the financial calculations and the time value money calculations, because they will be a significant component of that test number 2 in 2 weeks. So, all right. All right, have a good week.
Thank you. Have a good week.
Yep, you too.